представляться? Или, ну,
Да, конечно, конечно, обязательно, что и вот, что Милсет, все такое.
Сергеевич, у нас на YouTube пойдет перевод, пойдет видео с русским переводом,
Да-да-да, все верно.
я сделал запись, чтобы в том
Был с
числе у нас
английским.
была английский, да.
Замечательно, да, потому что если мы потом это выложим еще с запись в Ютубе с английским, то мы по Милсет можем это еще распространить.
Отлично.
Здравствуйте.
Добрый день, коллеги.
Можно начинать.
Правильно я понимаю, что я начинаю, да? Мгм. Так. Всем доброго дня, доброго вечера, кто откуда нас смотрит. Мы начинаем интернет-мост между Россией и Канадой на тему исследовательской и проектной деятельности учащихся в образовании вчера, сегодня и завтра. Кейсы России и Канады. Меня зовут Ксения Сальникова. Я представляю здесь международное движение содействия научно-техническому досугу молодежи Милсет. Это такая большая международная организация, где я вхожу в исполнительный комитет, а также являюсь советником по программам. И, соответственно, давайте я представлю перед тем, как представить наших гостей, давайте я скажу, что этот интернет-мост организуется Центром общего и дополнительного образования имени Пинского института образования и высшей школы экономики в рамках конференции «Память Анатолия Пинского. Новая школа 20 лет спустя», а также региональным отделением Милсет Восток. Это отделение действует на территории России и стран СНГ. Теперь перейдем к представлению наших спикеров. Я рада представить господина Ренни Барлоу, вице-президента Милсет, исполнитель директора Национальной ассоциации «Молодые ученые Канады». Ренни, доброе утро. И наш второй спикер России. Алексей Обухов, кандидат психологических наук, ведущий эксперт Центра общего и дополнительного образования имени Пинского института образования и высшей школы экономики, главный редактор журнала «Исследователь» и соучредитель межрегионального общественного движения творческих педагогов-исследователей.
Добрый вечер.
Добрый вечер. Итак, наш интернет-мост посвящен развитию исследовательской проектной деятельности в образовании. Сейчас, уже в 21 веке, данная деятельность и в России, и в Канаде стала таким мейнстримом, да, и от эффективных практик эксклюзивных школ и центров образования перешла уже в нормы массового образования. Но сегодня мы хотим посмотреть, как это развивалось в исторической перспективе и обсудить прогнозы на будущее. Поэтому в первой части нашего интернет-моста, нашей дискуссии мы дадим слово нашим спикерам, которые на примере своей страны расскажут, как зарождалась проектная исследовательская деятельность, как она развивалась и продолжает развиваться. А после этого, уже опираясь на кейсы этих двух стран, мы перейдем к дискуссии о будущем, да, и обсудим, какие же перспективы проектной деятельности, в частности, ее масштабирование от опыта отдельных школ уже в государственные стандарты образования. Станет ли она действительно массовым таким направлением в образовании или останется все-таки альтернативной, периферийной формой обучения? Итак, начинаем. И я рада предоставить слово Ренни Барлоу. Рени, можешь тогда включить демонстрацию экрана. Я обращаюсь к нашим участникам, всех, кто смотрит нас и в YouTube, и в Zoom. У нас есть чат. вы можете задавать вопросы. После каждого доклада мы обязательно зададим ваши вопросы уточняющего характера, которые будут, и выделим время, чтобы спикеры ответили. Так что пишите и в Zoom, в чате, и в комментариях в YouTube. Мы начинаем. Рени, пожалуйста.
Спасибо, Ksenia. Do you want me to share my screen with the presentation? Okay. I may have to quit and sign in again.
Слушай, Рени, кажется, нажал не ту кнопку. Он, мне кажется, куда-то убежал. У тебя микрофон выключен, Ксения.
Что мы тогда подождем или передадим слово тебе тогда?
Ну, давай попробуем. Интересно, главное, чтобы он понял, что он отключился. А то вдруг он нам сейчас рассказывает, мы внимательно как бы слушаем. А вот он подключился снова.
Okay, my apologies. My computer is ready to set up sharing the screen, so I will do that now. Okay. Now I need to share the screen. Okay, can everyone see the screen? Okay. Ksenia, can you confirm that everyone can see the screen?
Yes, I can.
Oh, very good, very good. Okay, my apologies for the delay. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here, to be of today's conference, and I'm going to take a little bit of time to talk about the history of project-based STEM in Canada, a little bit generally around the world, but interestingly, the situation starts in Russia, accidentally and unintentionally, but with the launch of Sputnik, it triggered a reaction around the world, but particularly in the United States, that has gotten us in many ways to where we are today. So we can thank Russia for kicking this off with the launch of Sputnik 1, and then the resulting situation was what some people have called the Sputnik crisis in the United States, where the U.S. Tried very hard to catch up and stay with Russia in the space race, and at least in the very beginning, had a difficult time. You see here a picture of from 1957 of one of their early rockets exploding on the launch pad, and they had a whole series of these, and it became a very serious issue in the United States that Russia was gaining a significant lead in science, technology, engineering, and math, and that the US and the rest of the world really needed to catch up. So there were a number of things that came from that response. They finally managed to launch a successful satellite. They created a number of agencies. They increased funding to the National Science Foundation. Unfortunately, increased focus on missile defense. But the key piece was that they made a major investment in science and mathematics education because they believed that education was going to be the key to moving into this new age of space exploration and science and technology. So really, project-based STEM is in many ways a product of the space race. Canada joined that in 1962. Canada was actually the third country in space after Russia and the US with the launch of this satellite, Alouette 1, which was a communications satellite. And shortly after that, and around that time, science projects and science fairs began to appear across the US, and they'd actually started a little bit earlier in the late 1940s, but really took off in the late 50s with the launch of Sputnik and the space race. So you see here some very old examples of STEM projects. Many of them not very sophisticated, but it was a move to doing projects and engaging youth and students in doing this kind of work. Then we went through a series of decades, at least here in US, Canada, many other countries in the West. I'm not sure of the parallel experience, so we look to Alexei to give us some background on that. But in the 1960s, much of education was characterized in Canada, in the United States, by discovery learning. And the idea behind this was that if you simply let children play and gave them interesting experiences, that they would somehow discover scientific principles and come to love science and learn a lot of the science that they were supposed to. It was problematic because while the kids had a great time, they didn't actually learn a great deal because trying to teach yourself science turns out not to be a very particularly good way to do that. So in the 1970s, things moved toward a little more structured, something called hands-on learning, where the focus was on activities. Students working with their hands, making sure that they were not just sitting listening to a teacher give lectures or talks or presentations, but that the students were active and that they were exploring. And this was better. Unfortunately, there are some issues with that, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Doing hands-on activities is great, but if your mind is not particularly engaged and all you're doing is playing, then it turns out not to be very productive either. So this was a phase in the 1970s. In the 1980s, it shifted towards something even more structured called inquiry learning. And this is still with us today and is the foundation for much of the project-based STEM that occurs in Canada anyway. And the idea is that students develop questions or identify problems and then are guided through the process of inquiry by their teachers and perhaps by mentors and other experts in the STEM field. And this turned out to be extremely successful. And the problem was that to many Western governments and to parents and so on, this did not look like the school that they had grown up in, which had tended to be much more structured, despite the fact that there was an emphasis on discovery learning and hands-on learning. And so as a result, in the 1990s, there was a shift to accountability and testing. And this was driven primarily from the United States, where they began to introduce a lot of standardized testing and felt that if you could simply teach kids and then score them, that somehow you would be able to effectively measure them against each other and against some standards. The problem with this, and I think this picture summarizes it pretty well, is that this was very much a mass production view of education, and that the idea was that students were some kind of product to come out of a factory and then be quality tested at the end of the process, and then that testing would then go on to determine the sort of future that they might be able to have. And this took various forms in the US with SAT testing, in Canada with provincial examinations, in the UK with the 11 plus exams and A-level and so on. The problem with this was that it had a very significant impact on students' interest in many subjects, but particularly the STEM subjects: science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And so in the early 2000s, in Canada, we began to look at the situation of whether students actually liked science. And this was the result in 2001. You see that grade 4 students really liked science. 90% of the students said they liked science. But by the time you get to grade 12, the number of students who said they liked science was quite low, particularly in physics, where it was down to about 30%. So we had 30% of the physics students in grade 12 liking science and 70% of them not. And that's not a particularly good situation if you're trying to develop a culture of STEM and science and technology. So 10 years later, they began to look in earnest, because this became quite a significant problem in Canada in terms of being interested in science. And so these are the numbers that we saw, and they're quite consistent with what we saw before. The scores, or the numbers at age 17 and 18, are a little bit better. So we were seeing the results of some work being done there, but still very definitely a decline as time went on. And people began to realize that the longer students stayed in school, the less they liked STEM and science, and that was not a particularly good situation. There really wasn't much of a gender difference. You can see that slightly more boys in the age 12 to 13 group were interested in science, but by the time you get through 14 to 16 and then 17 to 18, the numbers stayed relatively the same. So it was not a gender issue in Canada anyway. So what does make a difference? And it turns out that some educational research showed that if you want students to go into STEM and consider it for further education and as careers, it's not so much grades and marks and exam and test scores that matter. What really matters is that students view science as fun, inspiring, and important. And that requires a very different approach than simply teaching students and then giving them exams. The other thing that they determined, and this came out of a survey and some work in 2010 in Canada, is that around age 12 and 13, which for us is grade 7 and 8, is critical. It's a key time in which students make decisions, even though we tend to think that they make those decisions about whether they're going to be going to STEM, science and technology, a little bit later in high school or secondary school. It turns out they begin to make these decisions much earlier in grade 7 and 8. Particularly, they decide, am I a STEM kid or am I not? And so it really prompted an increased focus on STEM in grades 7 and 8. So when they surveyed students in that the 12 to 18-year-old age range, they found in 2010 that in Canada, 68% of the students said that science was important, which is not a bad score or not a bad result, but not as high as we would like. So the work began around inquiry learning and trying to develop these things. And they also tried to get at a little bit more clearly what was going on in terms of students' interest in STEM. And so you can see that reasonably equally across the ages from 12 to 18, students had this declining sense that science was cool, that science was fun, and that science was inspiring. But it's not too bad. However, when you look at is science boring? Is it difficult? Is it complicated? We see that there are some pretty significant increases, particularly around the difficulty and the level of complication. And that's not to say that we should be making science just incredibly easy, because science is difficult. Science is not an easy thing to learn, but there was a very strong perception amongst students that it was difficult, complicated, and basically the conclusion was for many students that it was not for them. And so they would opt out of science courses in secondary school, and that very significantly limited what they could do in university and in future careers. So one final chart. This was the result that we were seeing in 2012 in Canada, was that only 32% of high school students ended up in grade 12 taking biology, 23% taking chemistry, and only 14% taking physics, which are very low numbers and were of significant concern. So a lot of work has been done since, and I guess the other most troubling thing, or reasonably troubling thing, was the emergence of the OECD, the PISA studies, and in 2012, Canada was in 11th place, and reflecting on that, it wasn't that bad at that time, but it was not particularly well received in Canada, that we were in 11th place in the world in terms of science achievement. And so over the next period of time, there was a significant amount of work done in research and also in changing classroom practice to introduce much more inquiry-based learning and engage students, because, as was pointed out, if students like science and technology, they are much more likely to stay with it, and they're much more likely to do well with it. So 6 years later, we're pleased to report that Canada has risen a couple of places and is now in 8th place in the PISA science achievement, which is pretty good. So we've made some good strides. And I guess to come back to how do we make this change? In Canada, we look at we're hockey fans, very significant hockey fans, just like in Russia, and if you think about it, and certainly we did here, if we taught hockey like the way we were teaching science, not very many kids would play. You can imagine a classroom of a teacher at the front sitting down and talking about the theory of hockey and the proper technique for taking a slap shot or something like that. And very few kids would be interested in hockey if that's what we did. No, what we actually do is we put kids out on the ice when they can barely skate, and give them a stick and a puck and tell them to go have fun and try it out. And then gradually, as students develop their skills, we coach them along and help them develop those skills. So if we look at that, traditional STEM learning has this focus on memorization. It tends to be the teacher at the front of the classroom. More or less, it completely ignores whatever the students know and understand, because really the focus is on the teacher transmitting knowledge and is trying to lead students to understand what the correct answers are to whether it's problems or to just the subject content in general. And we know from all this research that it's not fun for students, it's not inspiring, and it's also, most significantly, not an authentic STEM experience. This is not what scientists and engineers do. Scientists and engineers do not sit around all day listening to somebody talk to them. They get their hands dirty, they try things, they play, they experiment, and then things don't work, and they figure out why, and then they try it again, and they go through this very iterative process, which looks nothing like sitting in a classroom listening to lectures from a teacher. In inquiry-based learning, students are actually doing STEM. They identify and work on real problems. They do real experiments, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but they have real discussions, and as a result, there's real enthusiasm. And that's really the key difference between these techniques. The research, and I've talked a little bit about that, says that what you need to do to make this happen is to provide engaging materials, to identify and value students' ideas and understanding. And one of the interesting things is that students, by the time they go to school, have some very well-formed ideas about how the world works. And if you think about it, very, very young children, just from their day-to-day experiences, are learning about gravity. They're learning about psychology. When a student or when a young child takes the spoon off the tray and drops it on the floor, they're beginning to build this understanding that when you let things go, they fall down, and they build this idea and this understanding of gravity and how it works. And that's one of the reasons why something like a balloon filled with helium is so fascinating to very small children, because it basically breaks the rules. When you drop things and let things go, they're supposed to fall down, but balloons filled with helium fall up, and that prompts all kinds of questions and delight, and so young kids are very interested in when things don't behave the way they think they're supposed to. So we need to value those ideas and their understandings, and have students explain how they see the situation, and then guide them to experiment and test things to come to some conclusions that help to show that perhaps there are some other ways of looking at this. And a lot of that happens through dialogue in small groups. I mentioned the idea of hands-on activities. These became very popular, and the problem with simply having hands-on activities, just doing a lot of activities where kids are working and doing things, is you end up with experiments that are not experiments. There are experiments where the result is already known. In fact, in some textbooks, the experiment is written out there, and it tells you at the end what you're supposed to find. Well, that's not an experiment; that's a recipe. And so if we want to teach kids to follow recipes, that's fine, but that's not really STEM. What we want them to do is give them a problem, give them the materials to potentially solve that problem, and then have them use their creativity and their thinking processes to work through finding a solution. Also, typically, all students end up doing the same activity. The result of that is that at the end of the class, students have very little other, because they all did the same thing. They saw the same thing. They came to the same result. And what is there to talk about? So if it's at all possible, giving them the materials, allowing them to play and experiment and identify interesting things so that they actually can share, and it becomes a very collaborative environment, very much like the scientific community, where through papers and conferences, ideas are shared and discussed, even within a university. People meet, the question they ask, what are you working on? What did you find? Or research teams, graduate students, and so on. So much more authentic experience. And often the discussion that we ask for from students is written as part of a lab report. Well, that, of course, is the result that ends up in a scientific journal. But before that happens, there's a great deal of one-to-one personal dialogue that goes on, and often we don't let that happen in classrooms. And we need to encourage in small groups students to discuss their results, share things, try things, and experiment. So using your hands is great, but you also need to use your head, and that's a key piece in all of this. So we need to encourage students to play with a variety of phenomenon, and play is not a particularly well-received word in many educational settings, but truly, when I talk with scientists, many of them say, "I can't believe I get paid to play for a living," and by trying things, experimenting, they said basically it's just a continuation of the curiosity that found in their childhood. So we need to really encourage students to play with materials, explore multiple questions there's no need for the whole class to all be looking at the same question. They can be looking at the same materials, perhaps the same phenomena, but they can be exploring different aspects, and then they actually have something to talk about when they get together in small groups and for class discussions. So very, very productive and much more effective way to do this. We touched on this a little earlier, the idea that students have principled understanding, principled knowledge that they bring to the classroom. If you ask a student in grade 2 or grade 3 to explain why fall, talking about gravity, they will give you all kinds of incredible explanations, like the air pushes things down to the ground, or they to give you the scientifically accepted explanation of universal gravitation. But by understanding how they understand it, you can actually begin to see their world and how they sit. And these ideas are highly developed and persistent. There's a lovely research piece that was done in the United States at MIT, one of the leading universities for engineering, and they found that university graduates, engineers, often reverted to their childhood explanations for things in areas of science and technology where they were not familiar with things. So these things last through to adulthood, and if we don't address them and acknowledge them and pay attention to them, then we run the risk of not actually achieving very much in terms of our classroom STEM education. So you ignore those ideas at your peril. It's a lot of fun to talk with students and learn how they explain things, and then activities to help them look at things a little bit differently. So students do understand we need to help students make their understandings explicit. We need to help them describe and explain what they see, value their hypotheses, and then provide materials and activities that will run counter to the hypotheses that perhaps are not scientifically correct. So, the idea of all things fall down, a helium-filled balloon is perfect for that. Shows that no, some things actually fall up, and we need an understanding of how things fall that explains all of that. And it's best to use materials to start those investigations and discussions, as opposed to simply talking to students at the Blackboard or Smartboard or whatever it is you're using. So the final piece in all of this is that student discussion is really critical. It's necessary. You can't simply have discussions. You still have to have all the activities, but having students talk amongst themselves is critical for helping them develop those understandings, because they, as I mentioned, they come to class already having some understandings, and they need to share those and test those out against their peers and hear from others. And that leads to what's called in the research exploratory talk, where they try ideas. It's almost like hypothesizing and trying out ideas to explain various phenomena. And the key here is to avoid too much structure. If the teacher provides all the guidance, the questions, everything, this discussion in small groups is not very productive. You want to leave it reasonably open-ended, and then have students present their findings after 10 minutes or 20 minutes or so of discussion. It works extremely well. So in summary, this approach relies on hands-on activities, using interesting and accessible phenomena, day-to-day things, things that kids would find around the house. When I was teaching, particularly grade 7 and 8 students, I would try to find things that they would find in their, in their basement or at the store or whatever, and find interesting things about those, and then begin by playing with those things, try testing them out, seeing what's interesting about them, and then asking them to encourage questions, encouraging them to ask questions. In terms of student ideas, we need to ensure that students construct new and more scientific understandings. So we try to move them from where they are, but we need to understand where they are and how they understand things, and then move them toward more scientific understandings through experience, not through standing at the blackboard or the smartboard telling them they're wrong and that this is the correct scientific idea, but guiding them through a process where they can actually develop that understanding themselves. And the small group work is really the primary strategy for doing that. So I want to move on a little bit, and oh yes, right. So what's happened recently is that there's beginning to be a focus on the bigger picture. So inquiry learning, project-based learning is pretty well established now. There's a very strong acknowledgement, certainly in Canada, the United States, and many other parts of the world, that this is a highly effective way to teach science and technology. Now there's much more of a movement to look at the broader educational context, and in 2018, Michael Fullan, who is a Canadian education researcher, published a book called Deep Learning, and he's developing a network of schools and educators around the world. But in that book, there was this rather provocative statement that said there is no reason for the majority of students to take conventional schooling seriously. And he was looking at the situation where students live in a digital world. They can access virtually any piece of information they want in moments, often on their phone, which is in their pocket. And so the traditional model of education, which is in many ways sometimes still focused on transmitting knowledge to students, looks pretty irrelevant to students because they can access information any way they want, and also they many of the issues that they see in the world they don't seem particularly connected to. Because and school particularly tends to focus on traditional understandings and the content that we've always taught, and doesn't necessarily focus on current issues of the world, energy and climate change and so on. And so he also went on to say that what gives humans meaning in life is a strong sense of identity around a purpose or passion, creativity and mastery in relation to a valued pursuit, and connectedness with the world and others. And so this initiative called Deep Learning actually is focused on developing 6 global competencies, referred to here as the 6 C's because they all start with C, but they are character, citizenship, collaboration, communication, creativity, and critical thinking. And the work that he's done and this movement is really focused on how to engage students in real world issues, real world problems, and have that as the starting point for learning. Because then learning becomes much more relevant, and students actually care about what it is they're doing. From our perspective at Youth Science Canada, we've formulated this into we call it mystemspace.ca. And you can see that our challenge on the screen is, how will you change the world? And if you talk with students, that's actually what they care about, what they want to do. They want to change the world. They want to make a difference. They want to help people. They want to make the world a better place. And school often does not seem like the place and the way to do that. So on our website, we have students who maybe have an idea but don't have a project, and we'll help them through getting started on a project. In some cases, they already have a project that they're working on, and we want to help them develop that project even further. So that's the homepage of our youth site to guide you through the development of a project. A little further on in the process, Youth Science Canada has 8 challenges that we have with students, and that screen didn't come out all that well, but the 8 challenges, you notice that these are not biology or chemistry or astronomy or physics or mathematics. These are challenges that face the world, the country, their community, and that they can get engaged in. So agriculture, fisheries, and food, curiosity and ingenuity, the first part of that word is missing, digital technology, disease and illness, very appropriate for the world that we're in currently with COVID, energy, environment and climate change, health and wellness, and natural resources. And so we're working to inspire Canadian students to tackle these problems and to look at these from their community perspective, the national perspective, and the global perspective, and say, what difference? How can I make a difference? What can I do that will make the world a better place, and address problems and questions in these 8 areas? So we've developed a template. We had to take our competition online as a result of COVID, but this is our template, and you may be used to the typical scientific lab report, which starts with purpose and method and hypothesis and all those sorts of things. We've tried to use a little more youth-friendly language. We start with a summary and a video, and then we ask why. Why did you do the project? Where did the idea come from, and so on. How did you do the project? What were the methods? What were the techniques that you used? What did you learn? So what? Why does it matter? Why does this? Why will this make a difference? How will this help people? And then what's next? What are you going to do? What you based on what you've learned now? Where are you going to take this project? What ideas do you have for the future? And this has turned out to be extremely successful, particularly in our online fair. So we have about 500,000 youth doing STEM projects across the country, which in Russia is probably not a very large number, but when you consider Canada has about 35 million people, 500,000 students is pretty good. And we have good coverage of students working on these things all over the country, all the way up into the very northern Arctic areas, and then of course a large concentration in the south where most of our population lives. But we do have a good coverage across the country. We have about 25,000 students who then go to regional STEM fairs at those 107 across the country. And then out of those, about 500 end up at our national championships, our national fair, the Canada-wide Science Fair. And we give out awards and scholarships. Those are our gold, silver, and bronze medals that we give out to students. And we also have some prize money and scholarship money attached to that, roughly $1 million Canadian, 57 million rubles, and almost all of that is scholarships to various universities across Canada. So that's the nature of our competition. That's what it looks like when we don't have a COVID year. So this have their project set up, and we have a lot of visitors in, and it gets quite busy. As you can see, we invite a lot of schools to come and visit, and it's a great event. In COVID times, it looks like this online, and we had students participating, and then if you go into the project zone, you actually see this there. You see our 8 challenges, and then some projects below. We actually had 374 students participate in the National Fair this year. But this is a really interesting way for students to present projects using that template that I showed you. And so, as I say, we had 337 projects, 374 finalists this past May. We did 1,078 judging interviews with 310 judges using Microsoft Teams. That was a pretty interesting challenge with the students being all over the country, but it was very productive and worked well. And most interestingly for us, we had 51,000 students and teachers visit online, and that was we were very, very happy with that, and so it's becoming pretty popular as an event and activity across the country. So that gives you a little bit of an overview of the history. sort of how we got to where we are in Canada and many other Western countries, I think, and a little bit of a look at what we do in terms of STEM projects and our science fairs. And with that, I will turn it back to Ksenia.
Thank you very much, Renee, for the brilliant presentation. We already have some reaction in the chat. It's in Russian, but I can translate that. Reaction is very positive, that your report was really clear, right, and very, very interesting and useful for all of us. Well,
Thank you.
And I would like to ask you, I really enjoyed, I really like what you told us about small children, how they are thinking, how they do explain scientific phenomena, and how the teachers can look into their world and try to understand them and explain. Well, but my question is, do you in Canada introduce any kind of science learning project and research activity in primary school? Because mainly you are talking about secondary and high school.
Yes, and that's the focus for our organization, is primarily at the grade 7 to grade 12 level. But absolutely, we have lots of work in that way in primary school. In fact, in some schools it starts in kindergarten, so almost preschool. We have some lovely examples. When I was a school principal, I had a teacher who did some work with a grade 1 class, and they were testing. They wanted she was interested in the kinds of questions that students had, and so in the winter in Canada, of course, just like in Russia, it's very cold, and so students put mittens on their hands, and so how the question students had was, do mittens keep your hands warm or make your hands warm? And they came up with this brilliant idea where they took teddy bears and put mittens on the teddy bears, and then took thermometers and put the thermometer in the mittens to see whether the teddy bear's hands got any warmer using the mittens, and of course not. And so that was very curious to the kids, because they thought that the mittens made their hands warm, and so when they put the mittens on their hands, and their hands actually did get warmer, then it wasn't the mittens that were making their hands warmer, it was the mittens that was keeping the heat in their on their hands, and so they got into a discussion about insulation and how that sort of thing can work. So absolutely, you can do that kind of work with very young children, and lead them from what is not a very scientific understanding, that mittens heat your hands, to a better understanding where mittens insulate your hands. And so we have lots of good examples of that, but absolutely in primary school, yes.
Thank you very much for your answer. We also have a question in YouTube. Вопрос от Светланы. Well, I will try to translate it. Do you have in Canada any practice of research and project activity that involves international cooperations, that involves participants from other country? If yes, could you tell us a little bit about the platforms where it takes place?
That's a really great question. I would say that's an area that we're actually a little bit behind. I think Russia and the work that Ksenia has done with the international school and things like that are actually quite a bit ahead of us on that. It's an area that we would like to move more toward. So actually, I think Ksenia has much better examples of that than I can provide. And we do have some. I mean, there are some students. The student who won the best project for in innovation for our Canada-wide science fair this year. Actually, did much of the testing of his because he built a device that looks at eyes and combines with a cell phone, and he did much of his testing in clinics in India, working in partnership with some doctors who we knew in India. And so it does happen, but in a formalized way, not very much. And as I say, I think you're doing much better with that in Russia than we are.
Thank you very much. We have the time only for one more question, and I can see the question in the Zoom chat. Alexei is asking, does the knowledge that students receive mean that he is able to implement it in life and that he wants to implement it in life?
Depends. Do you mean, are you referring to the learning that students gather just incidentally, as their children, or the knowledge that they gather in school?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Спасибо. Спасибо большое, Рени. И время переходить к следующему спикеру. Мне очень приятно пригласить к микрофону Алексея Сергеевича Обухова, чтобы он нам рассказал.
Over our time, so I'm giving the floor to Alexei Obukhov and his presentation on project and research activity for Russian school children. Thank you. I would also like to thank Reni. I was really happy to see him here, although we are separated by geography now. And to a certain degree, my presentation was built in a similar way. When I was preparing it, I didn't know the actual content of Remi's presentation, but now I will be trying to draw some lines between his presentation and mine so that we can see the parallel. But I will start from an earlier perspective. And this is a little bit provocative. I'm starting not from 1961 and Pinsky's new schools, but rather I'm starting with something that happened more than 100 years ago. Our association, NTI, that is mainly aimed at technical and scientific projects, had a centenary conference last year dedicated to the launch of the first planner article that dealt with flying apparatus, and it was an important part in the development of schools in our country, and it concentrated from the beginning on projects, on building, on development. This is something that has an even longer history, but not as part of schools actually by themselves, but as part of curricular activities, what is called additional education officially in Russia today. And so this strain of teaching has been active ever since, and it all started with three elements that started more than 100 years ago. It's the young nature researchers movement, which you see in the middle here, the opening of the first biology center for young people in Moscow in 19, and local history and local geography studies that some sources quote as starting even in the 17th century with the first school museum collections, but officially as a practice, its history is counted from 1915. The 1910s and 1920s were the time of an upsurge in regional educational programs that concentrated on regional and local history. They all had this idea that children should leave their classroom when the lesson is over and then go and study their local environment and its history by themselves, nature and history and industry and society and so on. This strain didn't develop continuously. Actually, because later on in the Soviet times, it moved over to things like tourism and trekking, not the actual study of local history. Another interesting point that I'd like to highlight here is that the project methodology in teaching is usually derived from Parker and other educators. But in our country, this method was central to the society we called Labor and Leisure for Children, founded by Stanislav Shatsky, whom you see here. All their activity was concentrated around projects and is believed to be the founder of the system of extracurricular or additional education. And so projects were a natural part of the whole system from the beginning, although perspectives might have changed with time. Within school, the history is different. In the 1920s, Ivan Svatkovsky published several methodology books and guidelines on projects at schools. And he used the American idea of practical projects. And this is a very informative history. My mother was actually studying at school according to this plan, and her memories were that the actual implementation was not that good at the level of mass education across the whole country. And this practice usually had little meaning for the students because it was not very well thought through by the teachers themselves. They did not know how the projects are built, how the internal logic of it works. They tried to use the method using their existing experience. In the 1930s, all of this was wound down, and our school became classical, traditional academic again. Education was now about attaining a given set of knowledge, although extracurricular activities still existed. And this development of extra school additional education in the Soviet Union comprised four main areas, and they all used inquiry and project methodologies. I myself went through almost all of this because I studied astronomy from grade 4 to grade 11, the last grade. I visited observatories. I took part in research programs that were run by the Soviet Union Academy of Sciences. And I must say that these four strains had their own differences. For example, in the biology and environment area, number one here, the first observation station was opened in 1918, and the first study circle was launched at the Moscow Zoo in 1924. It is still active. And also school forestry stations. It was a very active system from the 1950s, but it completely disappeared in the 90s. Some people are still trying to continue it, but largely it's gone. Once again, back to the school itself, in the 50s and 60s, it attained a new link to research. And there are three main formats that were developed. Number one, special teaching and research centers based at the leading universities, Moscow, Novosibirsk, Kiev. For example, academician Andrei Kolmogorov, the leading mathematician, it's a mathematical center at the Moscow University. It's still very active. And this doesn't mean that it was a research center where children would take part in actual research activities. Rather, they were studying in classes led by university professors, including Kolmogorov himself, the mission, and it was mainly aimed at developing their thinking skills, not actual research. It was a kind of a selective school program, and the two senior grades were also involved boarding for the children. The other type of collaboration is the School of Young professionals, so to say, School of Young Mathematicians, Biologists, and so on. Some of these schools for the young, run by universities, used laboratory techniques and open inquiry methods that were radically different from school lessons. Starting from the 50s and 60s, schools also started introducing research societies for the young students, but it was more like an imitation of scientific research than actual research. They invited researchers for lectures, but it was not about actual research by the students. The actual research in the second half was conducted outside of schools, if it ever involved school children. Another important factor that involved initiative and creativity for children in research and project was something that bloomed in the second half of the 20th century. This was science communication, mainly run through journals and magazines. They published problems to be solved, and it also involves the so-called the Society of Knowledge, which published books for children dedicated to sciences. I subscribed to one of the magazines in question, the Young Nature Researcher, listed here in top right, and these journals ran research activities on their own. Now the 90s. It's a very interesting development, and I will highlight it through individual cases. One of the last programs by the Soviet Union Academy of Sciences was the creation of the House of Research and Technological Creativity for young people in the premises of the Moscow Young Pioneers House. This institution was linked to various departments within the Academy of Sciences. But this was the time of historical changes, and in most cases, it amounted to research institute providing the children with their old and obsolete equipment. So that started with very, very modest beginnings, but it led to some real activities. For example, research expeditions with school children. We see a picture with myself, and my dog is even there, an expedition to the Chukotka Peninsula in the Arctic. Several groups were sent to the full solar eclipse zone and observed the eclipse. Starting with 1990, these groups, both in sciences and in humanities, started making expeditions to various regions of Russia.
Похожая история есть и в других городах, не только.
There are similar examples in other cities besides Moscow when experimental general education institutions started to open, such as the Moscow Chemical Lyceum, and later, under the auspices of the sciences of the earth and the space, a gymnasium, today Vernadsky School, is opened. And if the Chemical Lyceum, now a structural unit of one of Moscow's schools, involved children in serious scientific research of chemistry, together with the leading academical institutions and universities in chemistry. And the children, while still being school children, received patents, made discoveries, and so on. The gymnasium allowed children to get engaged in various research activities, and their level and difficulty depended on the student themselves. They didn't need to make large discoveries. but they needed to follow a certain cultural algorithm of research on the topic interesting to the students themselves. And these are two directions which are still being developed. So this motive behind this was very interesting. Prevents children from actually studying and doesn't allow for them to be engaged in research activities, to visit conferences, to go to expeditions. It is very difficult to receive leave from studies. And so this additional education gave its input to the schools. In St. Petersburg, the Anichkov Lyceum. And a number of competitions were established as well, which are still existing, such as Vernadsky competition or a youth science culture or a step to the future, which follow different models. Some of them were established by universities, which understood they needed strong students who knew the research methodology already, or by research communities who realized that the children, having completed their research, needed to demonstrate it to someone and discuss it with someone. I have visited several MILSET exhibitions, and I know that there is no differentiation between project and research, but in our tradition, which originated back in the 1990s, Soviet period, we strongly differentiate between research and projects. The research is culturally based on traditions of the USSR Academy of Sciences, science for the sake of science, and a project as a form of transforming reality according to one's personal ideas. And different communities that are developing the projects in education and the research culture are different. And I am part of the community that is mostly engaged in research activities of the students. And in the 2000s, I, together with my colleagues, came up by the research work of the school children, currently the Researcher magazine, and we published the concept of the development of research activities of students. 15 years later, I took a look at the text of this concept and I understood that it was implementable. We started compiling a thesaurus in order to give the same names to the same phenomena. It is very important to remember the name of Alexander Podyakov, who realized the value of supporting research of the preschool children via certain experiments, and of Alexander Savinkov, who started developing methodological approaches to involving preschool children and primary school students and developing their research capabilities. And education was supposed to be more active. The idea, reflection, and implementation would become a cycle of development. And we thought that this would be aimed at developing personality. That would show that education is developed correctly, and if it doesn't happen, the students are studying perhaps very complicated concepts, but the practice is not right. There was an interesting history of moving from top to bottom and from the bottom to the top. The practice of the forms of organizing research and project activities with university students started to descend into schools. Another aspect is when a small child, it is normal to research and study something, this is developed. and supported further on. And for many years, these two approaches did not meet. But a very important aspect for the self-realization of this practice, which for a long time was just an initiative not included in any federal standards and federal demands to education. And we realized that it was important to integrate our community with many regional communities and primarily with the Millset. And when our children went to Millset or World fairs, and we also hosted a number of Millset exhibitions, this mutual I think there were 5 participants, Russian, Mexican exhibitions, 6. In fact, one of them took place in Yakutia. And this line is also very important for us. We could measure what was happening in Russia against what was going on in many other countries, and collaborating with teachers and students from many countries, understand how and what should be done in here. And all the federal state education standards on all levels from preschool to high school include, to a certain extent, it is formulated. It doesn't mean the practice is widely accepted. It includes research and project activities at various stages. There are competitions organized by the researcher movement, which covers preschool, primary school, middle school, and high school. The majority of interesting competitions cover the high school and university, and this continues to be a dominating line and covered by research and project activities. In the 1990s and 2010s, the government is starting to actively invest in a new form of organizing additional education of children, which are based almost completely on research, sometimes project and engineering activities. This is Equatorium, IT Cube, clubs, Sirius Center, and so on. Perhaps the least known regional models, such as the smaller Academy of Sciences in the Saha-Yakutia region or Luminary in Dagestan. Some of them are non-governmental, such as the Luminary. Many private practices are starting to develop, such as ecological practices and practices related to ecology or research of the planet from space, called the Planet Patrol. We are now starting to bring a system to these and opening centers of additional education based on the logic of the 3-tier structure. It is not only related to the age, when the smaller children can get acquainted and older children and teenagers may delve deeper into the subject, but every child can choose a certain level and get a certain result in the end. Formally, this is only included at the level of the higher school, and the federal state educational standards only includes individual projects for high school students, which is obligatory, and the school needs to organize it somehow, because at the previous stages of education, this might exist in various forms, not necessarily specially organized and arranged. The school is obligated to provide a model of organizing these projects, and various schools approach it differently. This construct that we have attached to the famous phrase, think globally, act locally, these large ideas and large questions, and that the discussion of them does not only involve children, because they might not really understand these things, but we focus on how it is implemented locally in practice. In the current years, in the 2020s, we are actively involving digital technologies and tools. The School of Vernadsky has established a community and an online encyclopedia of the Russian villages, expeditions into the villages, communication with the local population, and the post-expedition period is an established practice. There is also an international collaboration which we initiated, an international research school, and Ksenia is its head. For many years, its activities were offline. This year we had to go online, of course, but not everything happen online. And this is currently an example of what never existed before and is now available for school students. And that's a separate question of availability. The students are not rushing to engage into these practices. It's a separate and difficult objective to involve children into these practices. And our Institute of Education is currently completing an experiment on studying the motivation and efficiency, self-efficiency of students, their motivation towards learning STEM subjects in online circles and clubs. This is additional education which is connected to school subjects. The experiment included more than 1,000 students from one region in Yakutia. And of course, simply offering courses to children in the online format does not really engage them. And online courses per se do not work. We need to either look for hybrid formats or for something else, or we can say that it can only work for initially highly motivated school children. Another thing is that we have faced, while transitioning from very good practices of separate schools and additional education centers to mass practices, we understood that it was important to teach the teachers. And the teachers started in the translational paradigm and are still using this paradigm, and it's an issue. Our magazine is accumulating information, and this is only productive when we start engaging with this teacher and helping them do something with their students. And from the beginning till the end, we are guiding them. And the product is a research or project by the student, guided by the teacher, and presented at a competition. And to finalize the transition to the future, we understand that when in the 2020 we found ourselves in the new normal, we realized that we need to find new formats. We cannot stop researching the world around if we are stuck at home. And one of my teams came up with the Park Online project, which later was named Research Online. And we realized that if we give short initial video instructions, engaging the children, the majority of them do get engaged and start performing the tasks of these open type questions, which should be taken home, which should be applied to their circumstances. And we found a high level of engagement of students. The logic of civil science, for instance, our colleagues from the Science Club movement came up with the project which you see on the screen of collecting herbarium. We called it Herbarium 2.0, when everyone is stuck at home, but they can still go out to the park, research the biodiversity, then upload it to a platform where mass of information is assembled, and it in the end contributes to research.
As I mentioned, the online international research school had an experimental run, and we realized that it is quite doable. And the international team was able to continue working, and we were trying to provide tutors and school teachers with additional resources for something like this, for work in the new norm. And for the next program, which will run in 2022, we'll be considering a hybrid format that would involve both online and offline events. A similar picture can be seen in the development of the local history activities. The new project Topos was launched very recently. It involved teamwork to solve problems, and an important motivation for the children was the opportunity to meet between teams at the next stage when their projects are done. And it is not just creating something, but also sharing it that was important. In the new situation, we found that this community of research and project groups saw a new motivation and a new wish for more involvement in expeditions, in outdoor projects, both for children, both the wish expressed by children themselves and their parents, because the schools are now often locked down and have distance education, remote education. Another project that found its implementation this summer was a project that involved actual research. It was aimed at both engaging children in research in a given place at different levels of complexity with different research tasks set for them, observation and monitoring of biodiversity. And school children were able to take part in both logistical components, in setting research tasks, and in solving these research tasks, in completing them. But this, by necessity, involved online coordination, and we found that it was a necessary part. Now, for the future, we face many choices, and we realize that research activities are more or less individualized in our practice, but we see that small groups are more effective and valuable. We have group tasks for research projects, but we don't have them all the time. It's not enough, as we think, and we need to find a new balance for individual and group tasks for these research projects. For example, we'd like to have more events that gather school children together that are not built in a competitive format. Competition, we find it's valuable to a certain degree, but cooperation is more productive in many cases. Currently, our administrators are mainly oriented towards the logic of competition, but we in the research community are more aimed at non-competitive formats, at cooperation that leads to a more complicated structure of the tasks in question. We're also trying to move from more elite oriented tasks with more complex projects that require equipment to something that might be reproduced at a more mass level. And we want to not just provide universities with future researchers, but rather at including all levels from kindergartens to colleges. Not just a single group that leads some activities from the very young age to more advanced level, We don't have any project like that, which would encompass all the gamut. We don't have any precedents of children being involved in this activity from kindergarten to university. But we'd like to see something in this area or something else that would include more ages. So we want to improve the systematic aspect of it for the near future. The current logic is more about selection and building a kind of a reservation for advanced studies, like the serious school that we have today. It has its own pros, but it also has limitations. That's why we are looking more at involvement and at openness more than selection. Currently, rewards, awards, and notes and marks are the key indicator, but we would like to move over to access to new resources as being the main result and not a reward by itself. And we would like to see more developments in STEM specifically. There are very few research projects for students in STEM today. Another important element is projects for younger children. And very often we see that activities for children are not aimed at building up their agency, but rather at repeating the existing patterns, while we see that agency would be required much more in the future. And the priority for the future is not to use external motivation, but rather support their internal initiatives, internal interests. We don't mean to remove external motivations at all, but we'd like to aim more attention at developing internal initiatives. We have had some projects that were completely open, where children were able to do what they want with the given material, and this really attracted their attention. This really made them more engaged and encouraged them to take part. Feedback criteria, criteria of quality that we got through feedback were adapted in the recent practice, and in the future we would like to use a kind of a library of success criteria for the projects that would not be the same for all areas of research. When it comes to technologies used and the formats, currently there is an emphasis on having the similar formats across all areas that can be easily reproduced, but we're looking more at the content. The introduction of digital platforms and other universal platforms would lead to more standardization, but we are looking more at variability for these systems. In the future, we'd like to see more variability, and we would like to start these projects with a problem to be solved, not from a given genre, like a presentation or a report. In the future, we'd like to see more of this. Less unification, more localization. Less template, more flexibility. And to develop this, we can see that today, practices and projects are either led by the society or led by the governmental initiatives. For example, the conferences that we arrange, their participation is hard to measure because competitions and conferences that have been around for 30 years and more don't see an increased participation. But now we see more competitions and conferences. They're not growing larger, but they're growing more numerous. And we cannot be sure that more added competitions would work as well. We are aiming at more of a public and governmental partnerships between these two types of organizing systems. We'd also like to introduce project and research activities into the ecosystem of education, to reach out to museums and natural parks so that they might also take part in these projects, not just schools or extracurricular centers. Currently, interactions are more vertical. The forms of interactions are more vertical, but we are striving for more open, horizontal, and network-oriented interactions between institutions who are active in this area. Currently, governmental support is mainly aimed at academic contexts, the Olympiads, that lead to university enrollment. And this is the main area being subsidized by the government today. But for the future, we are aiming at supporting other forms of projects, as these have already been improved significantly and are currently quite healthy. The last set of criteria for the future. Currently, projects are all taking place outside of lessons. The lessons are still very traditional, but we believe that even traditional lessons might gain a lot when research and projects are introduced as part of them. Some schools have already done it, but there is lots to improve. And the next step is to implement these projects not just within the school premises, but also in the world outside. Of course, currently we see many factors that lead children into the school more and more to do everything within it, but we are still waiting for the contrary trend. And currently, projects are dominated by teachers who launch the projects, but now for the future, we'd like to see children more selecting their tutors for their projects. Short-term projects would perhaps be complemented by long-term monitoring and multi-step projects in the future. That's the set of goals that we have for the future. That's it from me. Thank you, Alexei. This was a very systematic presentation. We already have questions from the Zoom chat, and you have, in fact, answered some of them in the course of your presentation. For example, people were asking about the interesting things that are now pushed outside of the school premises, but you have answered this and told us about the goals for the future. We have also got questions about international cooperation, and we've heard it from Alexei as well as from Reni. And of course, there are many international conferences and competitions that are international, where projects completed within the country are presented at international level, but the international research school that we run with Alexei provides an opportunity for the initial project work for international groups at this stage already.
Все-таки упомянутую тоже мной платформу Global Lab,
I have also mentioned the platform which was initially created for this purpose, and on the one hand, it's existed for quite a while, and students from different countries can suggest their project ideas that may involve other children. There is also another platform which allows at a rather interregional rather than international, the reactor form. But we know that these practices get launched. You were the curator of the science vector at a certain point, and these practices are rather follow the interaction of students and teachers from different schools, from different countries, as a follow-up to the interaction based on new ideas. This is being launched and is becoming a system. The precedents of school children from different countries to massively open projects and start to interact, I don't know such examples. I know examples of such platforms do exist, but they're not a mass practice. Thank you, Alexei. I also want to ask a few questions related to the presentation of Renée. Renée spoke about the system of STEM education, which in Canada is part of school education. What is happening in Russia in regard to STEM? Well, STEM is not something that was originated in Russia. It is something that we looked at based on the experience of Canada and the USA. And STEM, there is just one school which has a STEM department. Perhaps there are more already, but I know only one. This is called the Horace School, and we have one master's program preparing STEM teachers in the Moscow State Pedagogical University. It lasted for several years and is already over, and it was quite hard to find students who were willing to enroll. But the label of STEM and the practice, the interdisciplinarity is being used in preschool and primary school. Such programs for preschool children and primary school children do exist. We have a subject called The World Around Us at primary school, which easily fits the STEM or rather the STEAM logic. But it is the desire and the will of the school itself. It depends on the preparedness of the teachers and their ability to follow this logic. We know there are various competitions and projects outside of school. The school curricula is grouped around certain subjects, but they are parallel processes, not integrated with one another. The general school curricula does not involve STEM. If some reports show a nice picture of STEM being in existence, in reality, these are separate subjects. And our Center of General and Additional Education is preparing a New Year gift for school teachers. We have already completed one volume, two more are coming. We are compiling 300 STEM problems, which teachers can use in practice from the 1st to 11 grades. This is a beautiful gift. If I may, I'll move on to the following questions. It's interesting to learn about the universal competencies, which Renée also mentioned, and which are developed in the process of project and research activities. Renée mentioned 6 competencies. The 4K are known in Russia, or the 4C. They are being researched by researchers, including the High School of Economics. They include teamwork, creativity, critical thinking, and communication. Renée also mentioned 2 more. Those were citizenship and character. If I'm not mistaken, this might be translated into Russian as personal development and citizen conscience. Why don't they exist in our context? Our approach, besides the 4C, includes the new literacy also, and something is related to literacy. But the federal state education standards, the existing standards, include 3 levels of educational outcomes related to subjects, to personality, and those of meta subjects. The personal ones are written down, are listed, but are not diagnosed, because diagnosing personal results against a certain scale might be very dangerous. But what we may call patriotism is now program of upbringing, which is related to these subjects of the curricula, and it's an important construct which is part of the federal project on local studies, that is involvement of children in local research and local studies of their own local territory. It is integration research and project activity. This is also a project related to additional education development. That is the answer I'll give. I believe that international cooperation would also contribute to citizenship and patriotism if the local studies took part together with students from other countries or presented at international competitions. Of course, Ksenia, with you, we attempted this and it is what we will realize that if we find the barrier that preventing this from becoming a mass practice, so that every person would be able to collect something and then these inter-regional and international teams could be assembled. I think this is an important perspective. Of course, we cannot do it only by ourselves. With colleagues from Canada, from Europe and Asia, we will come to this eventually as we approach this with Mexico. Thank you very much. Now I suggest that we move on to the next part of our online bridge, and I would like to ask our speakers to briefly comment on each other's presentations and present some feedback. Renee, please, would you comment on Alexei's presentation somehow?
Sure. Thanks, Ksenia. I'll start just by picking up the conversation that we were having around character and citizenship, because I think it's interesting. The 4 C's that you identified are more or less global now in terms of their acceptance, but character is really focused on learning how to learn, and things like grit, the ability to stick with a problem, tenacity, perseverance, resilience, and those sorts of things are very much developed through projects. Always work out well. Things go wrong, they fail. You sort of start over, try again, whatever. Those are all character building kinds of things. And so the idea of self-regulation, responsibility, and integrity, just knowing how to work with others and that sort of thing. Citizenship is really focused around thinking like a global citizen and being aware and being interested in considering global issues and looking at things from a larger perspective. It's not so much as Alexei was talking about, patriotism, although that is a growing thing around the world. But the idea of looking at things and taking a worldview, and I think also having a sense that you can actually make a difference. That even though you seem like just one person amongst millions and billions, that one person's idea and one person's actions can actually make a significant difference. And so I think those 2 are really quite valuable additions to those 4 C's. Couple of comments on Alexei's presentation. Fascinating to hear about the history of education and project-based education in Russia, and not surprising that it goes back much earlier than what I was talking about. There were a couple of interesting things. One is that middle school is the area that has the least amount of activity in Russia in terms of projects and research, and one of the points that I made was that age 12, 13 has turned out in research to be very critical as a decision-making point. And so I would strongly encourage people to look at that age group, because in my experience and in the work of research, it's an area where you can affect significant change in the thinking of youth. By the time they get to later high school, things are quite set, students are quite resistant and cynical about what they can and can't do. But middle school students are much more open to big picture thinking if you give them the opportunity. And so that was a surprise. Many things are reinforced in Alexei's presentation, as in mine. The importance of small groups, the power of small groups to problems. I really like the idea of moving from the elite to sort of mass education. I would say, for our organization, Youth Science Canada, that's been the biggest shift in the last 5 years, has been to focus less on finding the best project in Canada, to engaging as many youth as possible, ideally every youth, in doing some kind of project, getting their ideas and their questions out there and encouraging them to take them on. And I think the other key in that is that there's often a focus, especially in education, around the development of STEM professionals. We need to develop doctors and researchers and university faculty and so on. But what we're learning, and especially I think through the pandemic and some of the reactions to the data and the information, is that every person needs to have a solid understanding of science and technology, how it works, what, when a scientist or a doctor comes out and based on research makes a statement, that it's not just their opinion. It's not just some idea. It's actually based on a process of checking information and so on. And I think if globally we had people who were perhaps more familiar with the processes of science and STEM, we would have less resistance to things like vaccines and better ability to deal with things like COVID. The other thing that you pointed out was the sort of mass gathering and mass contribution of that students can make and people can make to science, and citizen science is becoming quite a global phenomena. We see that here with projects like iButterfly, eBird, things like that, where people are making observations, contributing online, and contributing to in ways that researchers never could, because they simply can't be everywhere at once, to scientific studies. And I think the other thing is that you were talking about changing from external to internal motivation, and absolutely that's part of the character building and citizenship, is that when you see problems, whether it's in the world or your school or your local community or whatever, that you feel empowered to actually think about those and do something about it, and build that internal motivation, which I think is really critical. The other thing is that we do have a tendency sometimes to focus on the elite and to use the process of competitions and the process of some of these activities as filters to sort of weed out the best students and encourage them and not worry too much about the others. We also have to remember that skill development is iterative, and if you switch examples and look at students making videos, for example. Students have to make bad videos before they can make good videos, but the way that happens is they make bad videos and then they get comments on them, and they watch other videos and they learn by imitating, and they see something and they go, oh, that's an interesting way to do it, and then they take it. We need to have more of that experience for students in science and technology, so that they can imitate and then get feedback and guidance, and then begin to innovate on their own with those ideas. And I guess the final point that I picked up on, and that was the fact that in Russia, so much of this is happening in the area of additional education or extracurricular education. And that's not a bad thing, because our experience here in Canada is that, and it's global, I'm sure, that formal education has enormous inertia and is extremely difficult to change, and extracurricular, informal education, additional education is much more flexible, and so much of the innovation, I think, can happen in those areas, which is partly what attracted me out of formal education into the informal education, because I felt I could probably make more of a difference and have more of an impact there than working within schools and within school systems. So I would encourage you to continue focused on that area, and I think you'll begin to see many of the activities and the ideas, particularly if they're successful, in the additional education area be adopted into the formal education area. But teachers also need examples, and they need guidance in how to do some of these things. And because for many teachers, this is beyond their experience, and teachers tend to teach the way they were taught. So it's encourage you to continue doing what you're doing. There's some excellent work being done.
Спасибо
Thanks a
большое,
lot, Remy. And now, Alexei, how would you like to comment on what Renee has said? I think that my presentation by itself made several accents that belong to the same lines of thought that Remy has presented, but I think it might be very interesting to collate data of surveys on how popular these and other subjects are, or our PISA rankings in 2018. Canada was ranked 7th in the world, Russia was 32. So this is discouraging, but this led both educators and administrators to pay more attention to sciences in both school and additional education. And so the system is being set in place so that it's not individuals that drive it forward, but there is some kind of a system, some kind of a support from the government. And in the Soviet Union, both physics and chemistry and biology were based on laboratory work, on experiments, even if they were not as open-ended and project-oriented. And this system almost broke down with time, and currently more simulations and videos are used instead of laboratory experiments. It's cheaper, but it doesn't lead to results. If this video is used as a kind of a thought-provoking matter for an experiment of your own, when you see different results and outcomes, then it might inspire. But if it's just video instead of hands-on, then it would not lead to good knowledge and understanding. Thank you, Alexei. Then I think we can move on to discussing the future prospects for project and research. And I've got several questions to Renee.
About the future of the project-based learning and project and research activity in Canada are. Could you estimate how many schools in Canada actually, not on paper, but in fact, officially implement this project and research activity for school children? Alexei was talking about elitism, and what about Canada? And my second question is about, as far as I can see from your presentation, as we understand today's situation, today we can observe a kind of golden age of project and research activities, STEM education in Canada. But the logic, the history logic that could say that there could be a risk of, another rollback, rollback, as it already happened several times in the history. So what do you think? Has Canada achieved any balance, some balance between this project approach and theoretical subject learning? And if so, what is the key? Probably we can learn from you. Thank you very much. Could you answer this question?
Sure, thanks. Yes, the picture that I present is probably a little brighter than the reality. I would say we have about maybe 5 to 10% of schools across Canada that are actively participating in these kinds of things, and which is still reasonably good, but not nearly where we want to be. And part of the problem is that, as you pointed out, we have had regressions. We've had the pendulum swings, and then the pendulum swings back. And because many of the teachers who are coming into the profession now were taught during that period, which focused on a lot of standardized testing and so on, they were not exposed as children to the more open-ended ideas. You have to actually go back to the older teachers or the very recent teachers to have those kinds of experiences. So I suppose the bright light for Canada, and in Canada, education is structured differently than in many countries. In Canada, education is a provincial responsibility. It's not a national responsibility. So in Canada, we have 10 provinces and 3 territories, and each one of them has their own curriculum and their own particular approach to education, which at times is very good because it means that the education can be customized to that particular part of the country. At times it's a little frustrating because it means that things take much longer to disseminate or spread out across the country. But the bright light is that curricula in Canada are reviewed typically about every 10 years. And many of the provinces are coming up on reviewing their Scientology programs, and all of them that are going through a review are making a shift toward this deep learning approach, a focus on skills as opposed to content, and many of them are significantly adopting project-based approaches. So even though our numbers are, around 5 or 10% of schools across Canada, we will see an increase because it's being mandated by the government. I think it's a really nice example of how the extracurricular activities, the additional education activities, are helping to drive change in the formal education community, because they're seeing that in provinces that either never moved away from projects or have really developed projects are actually having better PISA scores and things like that. Because in Canada, when we report our PISA results, we get a national result, but we also do it by province, and some provinces do much better than others in Canada, and the ones that have a stronger focus on and that sort of thing tend to do better in the PISA scores. Increasing, those are the things that PISA is measuring, is skill development, not content knowledge, and so that's, I think, hopefully I answered your question.
And thank you very much, Renee. And I would like to ask, what is your personal expert opinion? To what extent it is possible that the majority of school children, and not just 10%, could master this project and research activity? What are the key barriers and how to overcome them?
I would say the key barrier is the inertia of the education system. We know that students are very capable, and except for those students perhaps with special needs who would really struggle significantly, most students can be engaged and be very productive, do good work in the area of projects. But typically schools see it as an activity that takes away from the covering the topics and the content that they think they are required to cover, and so they see that as making it impossible to cover the rest of the curriculum, when in fact working on projects and doing those kinds of inquiry-based activities cover an enormous range of both skill and content objectives and outcomes simultaneously, and so and students develop much richer experience as a result. So I think it's absolutely possible, but in many ways, teachers often underestimate the skills of their students. They look at the sorts of projects that could be done, and they say, well, my students could never do that, and so it's rarely the students that are the limiting factor. It tends to be school administration, school jurisdictions, and teachers who place those limitations on themselves and on their students, which is why I think there's such value in making this available as an extracurricular or additional education activity.
Спасибо большое, Рени. Я бы хотела
Thanks a lot, Renee. And now the same questions I'd like to say. How many schools, roughly, really on paper, are engaged in quality project and research activities? And is it really doable to allow students in Russia to take part in research and project activities to develop their skills in this way? How can we strike the balance between imparting knowledge and increasing research and project competencies across students? Well, we have a suggestion that we have already put on paper, and we're trying to implement it at the local level and further implement it in many other schools. I think it's possible to do it at the mass level when we remove this bar that the projects must be complicated and nothing else. We will achieve much better engagement and involvement if children can select the level of complexity, how much they want to dig into the subject, and if we have a broad spectrum of tasks for them. If we create a model that is easy to build into the typical curriculum and propose it to schools at large, then the number of schools that would be able to implement this practice at a good level would increase drastically. Currently, we have a paradox. We have schools where children are engaged at a very high level as a team, and this comprises almost the whole school. The number of these schools is very small, like 5 in Moscow, 1 in some other regions, and so on. Some regions lack this, and the same difference can be found in extracurricular activities at all. In some regions like Dagestan, we have lots of materials for extended study, but extracurricular activities are very few and project activities are very few. They are not used, project methods are not used at schools at all in this region. So I think that we have a lot of opportunities, but currently the processes of this pendulum movement are such that we're moving toward more standardization, unified curricula, same textbooks across the country. Digital platforms are now introduced and en masse, and this leads to both standardization and sometimes lack of inclusion because not everybody have equal access. But we have, for example, looked at the methodology of creating research project in the local space. It has worked very well, looking at the local environments and finding research objectives. But I think the issue is not just in the school system, but also in parents, because sometimes parents do support project activity very actively. And when the child feels the interest, but the parents don't believe it's necessary and useful, then even very good practices might fall on empty, barren earth, because it's very hard to find the children to enroll, even if you've got all the finances in place.
And I believe that the pandemic contribute to the development of these practices, making the system complicated and more varied. There will be distance, hybrid, face-to-face, and so on. There will be more open platforms based on mutual cooperation and interaction. There will be more options to set these research objectives that can be implemented locally. All this will be developing actively, and almost anyone can be involved if they want to. But an important aspect is that even the model of the unified state exam does not support this in mass schooling. It does not contradict to elite schools, but this is also in line with PISA type tasks, which and the uniform state exam is also shifting towards this type of tasks, and it will be pushing the mass school system. I've spoken to the vice director of one school from the Moscow region, and it turns out that the regional system requires reporting on the use of PISA tasks, but they want the teacher to use it formally. Formally doesn't mean in reality. And there is difficulty in managing the educational system in general, and particularly in this regard, that both the result and the process are being controlled simultaneously. And in this situation, the system is blocked. We either support various levels of results, of expertise, of being happy to meet certain normative demands, or we are trying to control the step-to-step process. One thing needs to be controlled, either the process or the result. But public administration is trying to control both the process and the result, and that creates a difficulty. We do see that the whole world has survived a change and uncertainty, and it has become obvious that the one who can quickly orient themselves in the process and utilize new technology is successful. This might shift the mass consciousness, show the people that this is actually valuable, not just something that you've learned. Thank you, Alexei. Thank you very much. And indeed, our discussion today was very interesting. We really would like to continue our discussion, but our time is up. So I suggest that we wrap up today's discussion with a final remark. Renee, perhaps you would want to say something to wrap up today's discussion.
Well, maybe I'll just jump in and comment on what Alexei just said, and that is that yes, educational mechanisms, and particularly at the national and in our case provincial levels, can be very daunting and challenging to work with because they move so slowly and change so slowly. But in the end, it's teachers' interaction with students that actually matters. The curriculum exists and teachers have some requirements to follow, but it's the interaction between teacher and student that ultimately determines what is going to happen in the student's experience. And so through extracurricular activities and providing resources to teachers and supporting teachers in doing what they want to achieve, because teachers want to do a good job. They're far less concerned about curriculum and jurisdictional issues. Teachers want to help kids. They want to help students learn. They want their students to be successful. And so if as external organizations, we can help them to do that and provide guidance and workshops and training and resources and examples and opportunities for them to help their students be successful, then we can actually affect, in some cases, more change than changes to curriculum. And so I would encourage you to stay with it. It works, and I hear some wonderful things that are happening, and I encourage you to carry on.
Спасибо большое, Рени, за
Thank
очень...
you very much, Renee, for your inspiring remarks. Alexei, would you like to respond to this idea of supporting the role of the teacher in this process? As for the role of the teacher, we are talking about it for a long time and we see it as a central one. Recently, when I've learned to prepare the teachers at a local level to work with this model, and the young teachers are very well engaged in this methodology. It is difficult to teach the old dog new tricks, but learning from scratch is easy. But an experienced teacher can also learn if they want to. Of course, for us, it is a key issue. We've discussed it little, and this is interaction with with parents, not the fact that it's not that only parents doing something for their children, but the parents to realize the value of something that their children want to do and support them emotionally. And I also believe that for us and for the development of our practice of research and projects in additional and in general education, the experience of such meetings is very important. Be they online meetings or offline meetings. It would be very interesting to see how it works in practice in Canada and to show Renee how it works in Russia, because the experience of seeing how teachers interact with students and how students interact with one another, how the administrative system works, doesn't mean that we will just transmit this experience and use it on our soil. It is how we add it to our experience and how various experiences allow us to construct something new in our circumstances. So I'm very grateful to Renee for the fact that he agreed to partake in our roundtable. I'm very happy to meet Renee in various formats everywhere, and I'm really looking forward to a meeting in Canada. Well, thank you very much, Alexei, Renee. We are now wrapping up our discussion on a very positive note. We do hope to continue it online and hopefully in person in Canada or in Russia. So see you, dear friends, and thank you for your participation.
До свидания.
Bye-bye.